Mr. Mate, a retired physician, Dr. Mate, if you would like to open up with 10 minutes opening statement to give us an idea where you are.
Well, thank you for including me in this conversation. It's a pleasure to be here. My work in Vancouver was for 12 years in the downtown east side of Vancouver, which I think was notorious throughout North America as the continent's most concentrated area of drug use. And right now I travel extensively internationally to speak on addiction and related issues. In terms of cannabis, first of all, I welcome the legislation that's going to bring some rationality to the policy around this substance. Drug laws in general, and I'll refer to that later, are quite irrational in the sense that they have no connection to logic and very little connection to science whatsoever. When it comes to marijuana, it's a substance that's been around for a long time. I think the first archaeological evidence of its use in human beings goes back 4,000 years, and it was first mentioned in a medical compendium published in China 2,700 years BC. So that's how long its use goes back to. In modern times, it was well known to the British in India, where a physician studied it and found it to be helpful in tempering nausea, in relaxing muscles, and in treating pain. And as a matter of fact, Queen Victoria herself was prescribed marijuana for menstrual cramps. So the medical use of the substance and what you might call its recreational use goes back a long time. In terms of its addictive potential, it's just a misbelief that the plant is either in itself addictive or that it's a gateway plant for other addictions. If there's a gateway substance to addictions, it's tobacco, because most people end up addicted to anything use tobacco first. But it's not a question of gateways. The fact about any substance, whether it's marijuana, whether it's heroin, whether it's alcohol, whether it's food, whether it's stimulants like cocaine, is that most people who try them even repeatedly never get addicted. But a minority will. And so the question always becomes, is the substance addictive? The answer is yes or no. In itself, nothing is addictive, and yet potentially everything is addictive. And whether something becomes addictive or not depends very much on the individual susceptibility. Now, those susceptibilities may be to some extent genetically determined, but for the most part, I don't think that's where the answer lies. I think fundamentally the substances that people use serve a function in their lives. So if you take the case of ADHD, it's well known, for example, that kids with attention deficit hyperactive disorder are more likely to use marijuana. Why? Because it calms the hyperactive brain. So very often addictions are self-medications. They begin as self-medications. Marijuana also soothes anxiety. Now, does that mean therefore it's benign? Not necessarily, because some people will start to self-medicate and they start using it to the point that now it creates a problem in their lives. Now it's an addiction. So the question of a substance being addictive is not to do with the substance itself, but whether or not a person uses them to the degree that creates negative impact on their lives. And like any other substance, marijuana can do that. So it's neither true that it's addictive, nor is it true that it's not addictive. Again, it's a very individual matter. And the question is, how do we approach that? Well, first of all, we have to approach it rationally. This may be shocking or surprising to non-medical personnel, but legal substances like tobacco and alcohol are medically far more harmful than almost any of the illegal substances. For example, if you take 1,000 people who are heavy smokers or heavy drinkers and compare them to 1,000 people who use heroin in a non-overdose amount every day, and you look at those people 10, 15, 20 years later, there's going to be much more disease and death in the alcohol and tobacco users than amongst the heroin users. Now, this is especially true for marijuana, so that long-term studies show that over time, marijuana users just don't suffer significant consequences, with one significant exception, and I hope the committee takes this into account, which is that there's a very persuasive study out of Britain that showed that if adolescents use marijuana extensively during their period of brain development, that can actually have deleterious effects on their long-term psychosocial and cognitive functioning. In other words, while it's true that marijuana is not as harmful as the already legal substances of tobacco and alcohol, it's also true that used extensively during the stage of brain development in adolescence, it can have negative long-term effects. Question is how to address these problems. Well, the trouble is with the adolescents and marijuana is that even when the substance has been completely illegal as up till now, it did not stop adolescents from using it. In fact, it's the easiest thing to get for almost anybody, age 12 onward. I don't know what in the legislation can possibly address that issue. I don't know what legal measures can stop the use by adolescents. In other words, when we're looking at prevention, we have to really look at why people use them, what's in the culture that's driving their use, and how can we address those issues. And unfortunately, when it comes to drug prevention strategies, the idea of telling kids that stuff is bad for them just doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because the kids that are listening to adults are not at risk. And the kids who are really at risk are not listening to adults. So the real issue is, how do we create conditions in our homes and in our schools where children will actually listen to what adults have to tell them? Because without that connection, that trust on the part of the adolescent, they will simply listen to their peer group far more closely than to the adults. When it comes to the treatment of any addiction, and again I say there is such a thing as marijuana addiction. When it comes to the treatment, and then I'll define addiction as any behavior, substance related or not, that a person craves, finds temporary pleasure in, and enjoys and finds relief in temporarily, but which causes negative consequences in the long term, and the person can't give it up. That's what an addiction is. And when it comes to treating any addiction, simply trying to address the addiction itself is inadequate, because there's always a reason why people use a substance or people engage in a certain behavior. And when you ask somebody, why use marijuana? Well, it makes me more relaxed. When you ask somebody why do you use heroin, because I don't feel emotional pain. In other words, the real problem is not the use of the marijuana or the heroin. The real problem is the emotional pain the person is having. The real problem is the overwhelmed state of their brain. In other words, the addictions are always a secondary attempt to solve a problem. And addiction treatments, which for the most part, I have to say in this country, don't address the real issues. Addiction treatment, for the most part, address the behavior of addiction, but not the underlying causes of it, not the underlying purposes that the individual finds in the behavior. Those treatments will be insufficient. And so that when it comes to prevention, I think we have to look at what conditions in this society promote substance use in large numbers. What is it that's making, if you look at the statistics for our children, the number of kids who are anxious and depressed, alienated, troubled, diagnosed with this, that, or the other is going up and up and up all the time, and every year the statistics are more and more dire. That's the real issue. The drug use then is a secondary phenomenon. It's those primary issues of what's in our society that's driving the mental discomfort of our youth. That's what we have to address. And those are broad social questions. When it comes to treatment, then it's, again, how do we address the trauma and the stress and the emotional distress of individuals who would then use substances to soothe those factors. So again, we have to look into causes rather than just behaviors. I don't know where I stand with my 10 minutes. I'd like to bring it to a close. I want to say only that I'm encouraged by Parliament's willingness to take a a rational perspective towards something that our attitude has been completely unscientific and irrational. I just really hope that the same open-mindedness and willingness to be realistic will at some point very soon be extended to drug policy in general, because all the irrationality that has characterized marijuana policy in this country for decades still characterizes opiate policy, for example. And the current epidemic of opioid overdoses could be addressed very effectively, for example, but only if we take science and experience into account, and only if we actually look at the evidence. And some years ago, I was asked to speak to a Senate committee on an omnibus crime bill, and I said to the honorable senators that as a physician, I'm expected to practice evidence-based medicine, and that's a good thing. And I wish only for Parliament, when it comes to drug laws, that you would practice evidence-based politics. Because the evidence internationally is that the current approaches to drug use in general not only do not work, they make the problem worse. And so, thank you again for your attention. I'm very encouraged by this moving forward, and I hope there'll be more to follow. Thank you.
And thank you. On behalf of the committee, we're very much